It's the week ending Saturday the 30th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Chancellor Rishi Sunak raising the national living wage in the UK's autumn budget, further investigations into the fatal shooting by Alec Baldwin while filming in New Mexico, and Japan's Princess Mako giving up her royal title to wed her commoner college sweetheart. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. And Ollie's on holiday this week, so I'm here to hopefully relatively seamlessly step into his shoes to unwrap this week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it's Julia O'Driscoll, and two for the price of one, it's freelancers Suchandrika, Chakrabarti and Alok. Now, just before we start, a warning that in this first story we will be discussing suicide, so if that's something you might find distressing, please do skip forward to the next story. Okay, Julia, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has the army failed to keep its soldiers safe?
You and our family as 3 platoon, aren't you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You're all brothers, work together, look after each other. All right, gentlemen?
Yes, sir.
I can imagine that, some of my more liberal or Marxist friends in the civilian world might call it brainwashing, but in the army you call it training. I don't know, maybe I am brainwashed.
A clip from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst documentary, which was released in January this year. Julia, what's your story?
So my story of the week starts back in February 2019, and it's the suicide of a female cadet who was training at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst at the time. Olivia Perks was 21 years old when she took her life, and it's been alleged that she had had an affair with an instructor at Sandhurst and feared disciplinary action as a result. This week, it's been reported in the Times that 7 officers and soldiers could be facing prosecution over her suicide for failing to carry out duties to protect Perks.
And so was there no support for her at Sandhurst, as far as we know?
So it's unclear at the moment. There's been an investigation by military police, but at the moment this Times report is kind of all we have to go on. Sources speaking to the Times did say that there's kind of a culture with toxic leadership and issues being swept under the carpet. So that's kind of the implication that we're getting, but we're really waiting for more information on what charges could potentially be brought.
I mean, Suchandrika, the military is known to be a very male-dominated environment. Even in that clip we just heard, they're referring to each other as brothers and gentlemen, no mention of women whatsoever. You know, many women have reported exactly what Julia just said, that it can be a toxic culture. Why is that exactly?
Well, it seems that the army has tried to be more inclusive over the last 20 years, but things haven't changed in terms of the culture inside the army. And so there was a really interesting British Medical Journal study that Julia flagged up, and they spoke to 750 women veterans who are really talking about medical results they've felt from the difficult culture inside the army. So 22.5% of these 750 women had faced sexual harassment. 5% of them have faced sexual assault, which is just terrifying. Nearly 23% emotional bullying. And it does seem like that can change according to the rank that the woman has. So she seemed to have more power. She might suffer more of that emotional bullying. And age seems to play into that as well, which makes a really complex picture. And then also 3.3% had faced physical assault. It just seems as though there are different rules at play in the army and that women seem to be the victims of those rules.
Yeah, I mean, those statistics that Suchandrika is talking about are in the army broadly, but this is a story very much about this elite training college for officers in the army. I mean, Alok, do you feel that there's a culture problem at this academy in particular?
While I don't want to make any sweeping statements about an institution that, I've not investigated myself, while there's been some additional information around Sandhurst related to the death of this particular officer cadet, which suggested that the administration of Sandhurst was either overwhelmed or didn't take the worries and concerns about mental health and abuse and other things as seriously as perhaps they should have done, and that there have been some changes to the administration as a result. So, clearly something is changing there, and one hopes that will bode well for the future. But it's sad that it takes the death of somebody to make that happen, when we know for a fact, as reported in that study that Suchandrika just talked about, but also from before as well, that people are hazed in these sorts of environments, that yes, there is a sort of macho culture of trying to be as good as you can and breaking you to your limit and all those things, but that is also ripe for abuse and people not dealing with these things properly. And you would think that the mental health services and other things set up around it would be incredibly strong to deal with that. So the fact that the most elite academy in the UK suffered this is just an indictment of the structure itself. It's hard to sort of pinpoint where the blame lies. It seems like it's an institutional problem in some way.
Julia, I suppose this leads to a wider conversation, the wider conversation that we're having about sexual harassment towards women not being taken seriously enough more broadly. If this sort of thing can happen in, a training institution, in a workplace, how can we feel confident that women are going to be able to feel safe outside of work as well?
I think that's a really good question, especially, I think, as we were saying, it's obviously known that the army is generally seen as a man's world. So what do we do in spaces where that's not necessarily the case? One thing that several female veterans, have pointed to as a result of the BMJ findings that we were talking about is that we need kind of more women in leadership positions, but also that women need to feel empowered in their being able to report instances confidentially, but also that they will be acted on with proper procedure and that they will be supported through that process as well. Until women know that those reports will be kind of treated with the utmost importance and confidentiality, I don't think that women will feel safe in reporting sexual harassment in any environment.
In talking about this particular case, the Ministry of Defence really wanted it to be seen as a once-off, that this was something that related to this cadet Perks, and that it wasn't about, they said explicitly, this is not an inquiry into the general practices at Sandhurst. But Suchandrika, it's quite hard not to see it as that, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of what we've heard recently about the Met Police and this idea that there's a bad apple. That's usually what the organisation tends to say when a case comes up, and there could be structural problems that are leading to that case happening. But while the investigation is going on, the institution obviously doesn't want to dob themselves in and say it's definitely us, it's our problem. So we have to see what happens with this report. It is just the one report and we can't read too much into it at the moment. But it does point to a kind of wider culture of certainly bullying and worse. And it does lead into other issues, such as the allegations against a British soldier for the murder of a Kenyan woman in 2012. That's also been brought up in our conversation before this podcast. And the idea of covering up crimes like that. And so it does sort of beg the question that soldiers have come back from the most difficult job possible, which is killing other people. Are they getting the right mental support? Are they getting the right support to rehabilitate them back into life? Or does the culture around what happens on the battlefield stays there, then extend to what happens when they come back from a tour? Because it does seem like that with perhaps this case and perhaps other cases we're not hearing about, which again has a woman as a victim and again has sort of practices of paying for sex as possibly part of army culture, which is very disturbing and just very worrying.
Alok, do you think that's fair? Do you think there is an element of let's brush this under the carpet going on in this case and perhaps that story of the murdered Kenyan woman? Are we seeing army, the senior elements of the military trying to deal with a story either internally, if not suppress it altogether?
Well, I think any major institution wants to deal with things internally and doesn't want a public relations disaster, which something like this is going to be, and the case in Kenya too. I think it's important to say that the most important thing in training, surely, is to learn about accountability. And if you're going to be asked to do all sorts of quite intense and extreme things as a soldier, and that is what's required of you, and you have to train for that. And the whole purpose of an academy like Sandhurst is to train you at these extremes. And some of that has to be that you have to know when you're going too far. It's important to note that in the case of this officer cadet who died, 7 officers and soldiers could face prosecution. They've been referred for further investigations, and I think that's important. It's important that other soldiers and other trainees see that this is a consequence. It's important when soldiers go overseas that they are not treated unfairly when they come back, but that there can be consequences. And all of that just in the end ties back to training. You know, when you're at these sorts of elite officer schools, you have to understand that there are consequences for your actions. You are given a huge license to do things that the rest of us in society cannot do, or are not allowed to do, but you have to use that responsibility wisely. And if you're not going to train the cadets to do this at officer school, then you're going to have problems for the rest of their career, and obviously for society at large.
I mean, Julia, Alok is talking there about what's being done to try to prevent this sort of thing happening again. What is the military trying to do to address these sorts of issues?
So one point that we mentioned earlier is about trying to ensure there are more women in senior leadership positions across the military, which is really important to kind of creating that cultural change that needs to be seen. There's also a Defence Committee inquiry that's going on at the moment, making further recommendations, whether kind of looking at women's experiences in the military from recruitment through to retirement. So I think that was going to be really interesting as well, looking at how women can be supported through the entirety of their career. As Suchandrika mentioned, it seems that younger women particularly struggle in the army. So I think this is going to be really important for looking at kind of the nuances of those careers and how support can best be given.
I saw in the UK Armed Forces Mental Health Report that 1 in 10 people within the military sought support with their mental health between 2020 and 2021, which, coming to Alok's point about the difficulties that people experience when serving in the military, almost seems startlingly low, especially when you compare those rates with the sorts of rates that you see outside the military. But at the very least, there's clear evidence here that people are reporting their struggles. Is that right, Suchandrika?
Yeah, it's impossible to imagine leaving such a job, especially when you've been on the front lines, and leaving it just completely kind of, well, that's fine, I'll compartmentalise that and carry on with my life. It does seem as though we depend on the army to protect things such as borders and other things, but what they often get in return, was it worth their sacrifice? As a country, we haven't looked after our veterans very well, and we're certainly not really looking after their health as well as we could at the moment. And with those figures being quite low, it does make me wonder if there's this culture of not asking for help or not admitting anything that could be perceived as, massive quotes here, a weakness. Because surely to survive in a very macho kind of system, you have to kind of have this veneer of everything's fine, I'm in my routine, it will get me through the days, the weeks, the months. I mean, to be away from your loved ones, to witness death and violence, then to just come back and maybe have a few counselling sessions, like what is it that they do need? I think possibly we don't know still.
But also the popular image of boot camp is that it's a pretty brutal place to be. Julia, this is your story of the week. I wonder if it's because you think that what we're seeing here could be a turning point for training soldiers. Is the military going to attempt to start building its recruits up rather than breaking them down?
I would really hope so. As you were saying about the number of reported mental health cases being quite low, I think that is an indicator that kind of getting on with dealing with these issues is just normalised. And the documentary, actually, the clip at the start that we looked at, there's a few moments where you see, one female cadet is crying and saying, of course, I still get homesick, but it's brushed over in a very quick 5-10 second clip, and then we're back to marching and the rest of it. And I really hope that actually, a lot of the videos and things that do come out about recruiting for the army are very kind of be part of the battle. And I hope that we could start to normalise a conversation around how we do support people who would like to be recruited into the army, who are in the army, and that this just becomes much more of a mainstream conversation in kind of the civilian world as well.
Okay. Alok, you're next after this.
Listeners, as the news becomes more polarised, it's easy to fall into an echo chamber just when it's more important than ever to be open-minded to other points of view. And that is where The Week magazine comes in. Each week, our editors curate the best of the week's British and international media, presenting you with all sides of the debate so you can make up your own mind on the issues that matter most. And you, podcast listeners, can now get a free trial of The Week magazine. To receive 6 free issues plus free digital access, visit theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code podcast. You won't have to pay anything for 6 weeks and can cancel anytime, no strings attached. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code podcast.
Alok, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
How to protect the Earth from an existential threat.
Until it hits.
A meteor shower.
This new one you're tracking. How big?
It's what we call a global killer. Nothing would survive, not even bacteria.
The United States government just asked us to save the world. Anybody want to say no?
You think we'll get hazard pay out of this?
A clip from the trailer for the Hollywood film Armageddon, which was released, and I cannot quite believe this, back in 1998. But anyway, Alok, I'm intrigued. What's your story?
So Bruce Willis in that film is tasked to fly to an asteroid and divert it from hitting the Earth. But in seriousness, these challenges exist in the world. If an asteroid was to hit the Earth, if it was big enough, it would destroy most life on Earth and create conditions so that we couldn't grow food and so on for many, many years. It would be a massive calamity, just to put it that way. So what NASA is doing in the next few weeks is launching its first ever mission to try and understand how to deflect an incoming asteroid. This is called the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, and it's a probe weighing about 600 kilos that in about a year's time will reach an asteroid called Dimorphos, which is 7 million miles from Earth. And Dimorphos orbits a slightly larger asteroid called Didymos. It's like a double system. And the idea is that DART, the NASA mission, will crash into the smaller asteroid. And then people on Earth will monitor how these things move around to see if the smaller asteroid's path is slightly changed or not. And it's testing an idea called kinetic impact. The idea is that if you whack something hard enough in space, you can sort of move the direction it's going. The idea being that if there is an asteroid coming towards Earth, and we find out about it maybe a few years beforehand, then we can deploy something like this to just gently nudge it out of the way. Because, if we have nothing at all, then it's going to hit us, and then that's a really bad idea.
I mean, in Hollywood's imagining, we tend to use like nuclear weapons to knock things not just off course, but to completely blow them up. Is that kind of the end goal potentially of the DART system?
No, you don't want to blow an asteroid up because first of all, you don't want to sort of launch a nuclear weapon into space, because what if it blows up on the launch pad? That's a very bad idea. So that's not a good idea at all. But even if you were to sort of somehow take bombs into space, and people have suggested these sorts of things, and of course in Armageddon, that's exactly what they do. If you were to blow something up in space that's coming towards you, then you get lots of debris. And you've then got, instead of one massive asteroid, you've got a billion little asteroids coming towards you, many of which might still be quite large, and you can't track them all, and that's a really bad idea. So this idea of making a much bigger mess is not a good one. Whereas what you can do is, just like I said, if you know about the asteroid many, many years in advance, maybe a decade in advance, and with current satellites and things, we can track asteroids really well. Then you can sort of just move it a slight amount, and over a long time, that tiny angular difference in the path will just nudge it possibly out of the way, and it's much, much safer and more predictable.
Julia, we know that the dinosaurs had a pretty bad encounter with an asteroid around 66 million years ago, but have there been any serious meteor strikes on the Earth in the more recent past?
So, reassured that apparently an asteroid that could cause catastrophic Earth-wide end to civilization is only likely to happen once every few million years. So National Geographic reassured me we can all rest easy. But in 2013, there was an incident where a meteor hit Chelyabinsk in Russia, and it landed 20 miles from the city, and the explosion carried 20 to 30 times the energy of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. So really, really significant. And then before that, there was a case in 1908 in Siberia as well. But NASA says now every year there's a 0.1% chance an asteroid big enough to destroy a city hitting Earth. So that the risk is relatively low.
So Alok talked about the fact that we are fairly good at spotting asteroids in general, but we're notoriously not very good at spotting objects coming at us from the direction of the sun. Suchandrika, have we had any recent near misses coming from that or any other direction aside from the ones that Julia's just mentioned?
We have had a really recent one, so I don't know what you were doing on the 16th of September 2021, but the Earth as a whole was having a bit of a near miss. So the 2021 SG was a near-Earth asteroid, and it approached from the direction of the sun, so it was invisible until a day later. We couldn't actually see it with our technology. And it got within half a lunar distance from the Earth, and then it went back off on its orbit.
So you mean it came effectively between the distance that the moon is from the Earth and us?
Yeah, scarily close. But we got lucky this time.
That is terrifying.
Yeah.
So, Alok, I mean, if we're having near misses like this, and we didn't spot this until a day after it went past, what can we actually do about this sort of thing?
Well, so first of all, you need to understand how to nudge asteroids out of the way, and so that's what the DART mission will do. And the European Space Agency has a mission as well in a few years that will go to the same asteroid system to try and understand a bit more about that one and how to plan future missions of this type. So this is all good, useful data, and it's useful to sort of understand how we might affect those things. But also another thing you can do, of course, is to increase your mapping of the skies. Now, the NASA has been really good in the last decade or so at scanning the skies to look for near-Earth objects, and it knows of around 1 million or so. But just between the Earth and Saturn, there's probably more than 1 billion asteroids. And then that doesn't include all of the asteroids and other objects that turn up from the clouds of detritus at the end of the outsides of the solar system, well, the edges of the solar system. I mean, it could be trillions, and we just don't know about any of those. So there are plans from NASA and others to actually, in the next coming decades, to build even more mapping exercise where you try and observe many, many more of these things and just keep track of them. The fundamental thing is that even though it's very difficult to see some of these things in certain directions, the Earth moves all the time, so the sun is not always in the same place at the different parts of the year, so it's very unlikely that something will come at you completely out of nowhere. And these things all obey the laws of physics, and we understand the gravity of the solar system very, very well. So, you can really map these things well into the future, and so work out there's a problem 10, 20, even 30 or 40 years' time.
I mean, we kicked off this segment with a clip from Armageddon. Is what we actually need here a plucky group of space miners to go up there and insert dynamite into incoming objects and extract the things that we need, though obviously being sensitive to the market forces of bringing too much platinum home with us, and then finding ways to knock them off course from their surface? Or is the idea of humans travelling onto near-Earth objects also unfeasible?
Look, nothing is impossible if you've got the money and the willpower to do it. So I think that the idea of blowing stuff up near the Earth is probably very bad. But if you're going to the asteroid belt and you can do a risk assessment to make sure that where you blow up will stay very far from Earth, then go for it. I mean, I just don't know. We can't even get people to Mars yet. Never mind something as complicated as a tiny little asteroid with very little gravity that's affected by the gravitational forces of all sorts of things around it. But this is just technology, right? It'll just take a long time to do. And if someone wants to do it, they can do it.
So, Julia, how important is this anyway?
That's a very good question, and that was exactly the question I asked when I first realised we were going to be talking about this today. Especially with COP26 starting in a couple of days, I think a lot of attention is on kind of, our planet more than kind of threats from outer space. But as I was researching, I found that one NASA scientist said that that asteroids hitting Earth are the only preventable natural disaster. And so actually, I think this is a really good use of resource and technology in terms of if we're looking at how we can combat kind of human issues of climate change, actually, why not also think about how we can use our outer space knowledge too?
Alok, is that fair? Do you think that this is something that we should be diverting resources into, particularly if that statistic about the threat of asteroids only presenting itself every million years is the case? Or should we be deprioritising this and focusing closer to home?
Well, I think you know my answer to that question already. But I'll just say one thing about this, about these sorts of missions in space and other things like that, is that this fits into the bucket of research about existential threats that might be very, very, very low, but could be catastrophic if they happened. So why would you not think about them and prepare for them? If we just prepared a bit better for viral threats and listened to people 20 years ago saying that there could be pandemics that stop entire economies, we would have had a different last couple of years, right? So it's all very well to not think about this stuff because it's very low probability. But we're not good at that. And so if we can get into the practice of identifying low probability, high danger events, then understanding them beforehand will give us just a bit of a heads up to dealing with them. And I think that humans, just because something is not right there in front of you, it doesn't mean that someone shouldn't be thinking about it. And the amount of money for this experiment is so tiny. I mean, it's tiny, and it's not even that big an experiment, and it'll provide invaluable data. If there's an asteroid that comes towards the Earth of the Bruce Willis kind, that kind of size, this could be the most important mission ever flown by the history of NASA.
Okay, well, in the absence of Bruce Willis coming to save us, Suchandrika, I'm coming to you next, after this. Suchandrika, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
So Guy the gorilla has one, Paddington Bear has one, but only 3 non-white women have one of these.
Traditionalists will say that by contesting these monuments, we're trying to alter the past. Instead, what we're trying to do is show the parts of the past that have been ignored. In particular, in this case, we're talking about the histories of enslaved people and what they contributed to the nation. So we're not just talking about adding information to monuments that exist or tearing down these monuments. We're also thinking about the monuments that haven't been built, the monuments that we should have to enslaved people.
Dr. Kirsty Warren, a specialist in the history and legacies of transatlantic slavery, speaking at the Museum of London last year. Suchandrika, what's happened this week?
So there's been a report by Art UK into what the statues in London are of, and they found that there are more statues of animals in London than of named women, which doesn't seem good. So there are about 1,500 monuments in the capital. They're everywhere you look. They're a great tourist attraction. 50 of those depict specific named women, as opposed to a muse or just a general nude, and nearly 100 of those statues are of animals. So really talking 2 animals to every one specific woman who's achieved something. And also of those 50 women, only 3 are dedicated to non-white women. And this has led Mayor Sadiq Khan to say that there's an urgent need to improve diversity amongst the monuments in our city's public spaces.
And so are there plans to rectify this to try to make it more proportionate?
Yep, so City Hall's announced £1 million to pay for new, more inclusive artwork. So we could look forward to more statues being unveiled in the city that will include more demographics.
Julia, if we see more statues being made from this point, are they going to just represent recent history, or will there be some scope for dedicating new monuments to people from the past who should have been recognised but haven't been?
That's a good question. I think, thinking about the clip that we started this story with, we would hope that there'd be a real historical look, as well as thinking about more modern figures as well. And it'd be interesting to know how that kind of conversation would take place and how those decisions would be prioritised.
Alok, after the Black Lives Matter protests, or sort of in conjunction really with them over the last couple of years, we saw a range of statues being toppled around the world. And then there was this sort of counter backlash from people who wanted to defend statues, a lot of whom said that they didn't want them to come down because we needed to protect our understanding of history. But is that the real purpose of statues, do you feel?
Well, no, obviously not. You can understand history by writing it down, by going to museums. There are many, many ways of preserving history that don't involve, putting slave traders on pedestals and all of that. If I'm just to step out of this argument, the political bit of this argument for one second, the idea that people of questionable background have been put onto pedestals and how they got there. These things are important decisions that we mustn't forget. This is what someone decided this, or some part of society decided this at some point in the past, and so we don't want to forget that happened. But also, that's not the same as preserving history. We also know that history is written by the winners. Statues are erected for all sorts of reasons that are not historical. If you think about statues across certain parts of the United States of Confederate generals and all of that, these things weren't around since the Civil War, celebrating those people in their moment of glory. They were built in the last 100 years to scare and indicate to black populations in some parts of that country that we will not forget that we once subjugated you and will continue to do that. I mean, that's my words, not theirs, but that's the indication. So in that sense, that's not history. That's glorifying violence, and so. I have one other thing to say about it is when you pull these statues down, I think it's important to record the history of the statues itself. You want to understand why the statue was there in the first place. You need that story to be told properly. But you also, if they are pulled down, then that needs to be recorded too in some way. I know that for example, in Bristol, the statue of slave trader Edward Colston is going to go on display. It's been defaced and it's going to go on display in a museum. And I think that's important to show that this was once put up. Then people decided that it wasn't good enough and that they wanted to deface it. This is the story now. These things evolve, and so should statues.
Yeah, Banksy had a suggestion for what should be done with the Colson monument, where he had an idea that you could put it back up, but also have it teetering on the brink of being pulled down by protesters who were also immortalized in bronze. But, Suchandrika, a lot of the monuments that exist around the UK, I suppose, speak to the fact that they were put up at a particular moment in history. There was a mania in the 19th century for putting up statues. What was behind that? And is it for that reason that so many of them are starting to look outdated today?
So I can't say for definite, but it strikes me that it's to do with the empire, and it's to do with an expression of power and where power lies. And there's an interesting kind of trend where statues being pulled down in the UK, in the US and in Belgium, but not so much in the countries that were colonised in the past and are now independent, because they also have statues. But it's really in the centres of power where a lot of those statues went up, and where we are considering, do we want our society to put its values on show in sort of these people? Are they the people who we should be putting forward and saying we venerate them? Because whatever you say about statues, a lot of us are Londoners on this podcast. We will walk past statues without a second glance because we live in London. But we do look up to statues physically. They are larger than life and they're on plinths. And so they do literally say this is who we stand for as a society. And so we'll say that sort of period of time, it strikes me that probably the British Empire was saying, like, look at us, the sun never sets on this stuff, and it never will. They got that bit wrong. But metal will outlast all of us. So I was thinking recently about statues in terms of doing a comedy show about them. And there's a recent statue of Princess Diana. And also Amy Winehouse has a statue of her unveiled on her 31st birthday, 2014. And it struck me that often when you have statues of women, which are still rare, often those women had to be suffering and very vulnerable in public. And their good works are part of the reason they have a statue, but also the fact that their fame and the way people sort of sympathise with them as part of it. And again, so we're sort of looking at statues as almost markers of celebrity or markers of how we felt about certain people. And it might be that statues stand for something slightly different now because we have other ways to memorialise people. So in a certain sense, they might be losing a certain kind of importance. But if we keep the ones from the past, we're saying that the story written by those victors in the past is still correct. We know that isn't true.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. Gary Young, who's a professor in sociology, is on the committee who decides what work of art goes on the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square. And he said he'll get lots of requests for various different people. And his answer has always been, if you can tell me who's on the other three plinths, you can have the fourth. At the point being, no one can. And I think that's a really good point that actually, are these good uses of public art nowadays? Are there not better ways for our public spaces to memorialise different people or periods of history that aren't necessarily so static, they're not outdated? And the Diana Memorial, some of the criticism from that was, just laughable. One critic said, could it be that Laura Ashley has made it onto a public monument? Which just, is also a bit sad, really, when you think about what that monument supposedly is meant to symbolise and stand for and meant to her sons. And actually, what service is it doing in a public space?
Gary Young, who you mentioned just there, Julia, I heard speaking, and he said that in his view, not only should we get rid of all statuary around the UK, but we should stop putting them up. Alok, is this the most logical fix?
I think it's very hard to be logical about this because statues embody so much more than history and other things. It's about emotion. It's about a feeling, isn't it? Something like a memorial statue for somebody who died young is different to celebrating a general, who commanded forces. They're just different things, aren't they? You made the point earlier about statues being sort of an older way of commemorating people, and now we have many more ways of doing these things. And I think that we still live in the shadow of the sort of art and the ways of commemoration of a century ago. And I think that statues perhaps play a larger role than perhaps they might because they're physical objects, that they're there in your physical space, and as well as having more statues of a more diverse population of people. I think it'd be interesting to investigate and encourage other types of memorialization, other types of celebration that play much more to the sort of the lives we live now, like digital memorializations. I think that rather than just thinking we should not put statues up at all, I think there's always going to be a population that wants statues, and we should argue that if they're going to want the statues, let's make them as diverse as possible. Let's not take ourselves out of that argument. But then let's think about other ways that people should be celebrated and named. It's about the naming of buildings, for example. It's about the naming of satellites, for example. There's all sorts of other ways that we remember people. And let's not just forget those when just talking about statues.
Well, that's probably all we have time for this week. My thanks to Julia, Suchandrika and Alok, all of whom deserve to be immortalised on a plinth, if not with a hologram. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if, by the way, you've found us today via a Spotify playlist, go to podcast and then tap follow now if you want to. I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And Ollie will be back to unwrap next week. So from me, for now, bye-bye.